Good evening, everybody. Hello. I know it's kind of odd, isn't it? We're here and we're in person. So my name's Bernadette Nunn, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to the library's author event this evening. I wish to acknowledge the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which these library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Before we begin, remember to check your mobile phones, please, and make sure that they're set to silent. The quick dive to the pocket. There'll be an opportunity for questions later in the evening, so don't be shy. Make sure you put your hand up and we will send you a sanitised mic to speak into. This is only the library's second in-person event since March last year, so how lucky are we, especially after lockdown last week, that we can all be here. So it's wonderful to see your masked faces and to see you in the flesh. I've been told I need to tell you a little bit about me, so let's keep it a little bit. I started my journalism career just up the road at the Colac Herald and then moved into regional television in Ballarat before moving to Channel 10 in Melbourne and then becoming a TV producer and presenter for the ABC's international TV service, broadcasting across Asia and the Pacific. And I now teach the next generation of journalists to succeed us both at Deakin and Melbourne universities. And I met our guest tonight, Gideon Haigh, at RMIT when we were both studying first-year journalism last millennium in 1984. Gideon is now...
Did you finish, Bernadette? I did 1 year and dropped out.
No, I didn't finish.
Yeah, okay.
We all did 1 year. In our defence, we worked in an industry at an era where it was all about delivering to deadline, and that was the only thing that mattered. In fact, there was quite a bit of cynicism about any academic achievement. Would you agree?
I shared it wholeheartedly and still do.
So let's not talk about my teaching career. Let's talk about your career. As an independent journalist, Gideon was born in London, grew up here in Manifold Heights, went to school in Geelong, now lives in Melbourne, where he still plays for the Yarras. A few nods, you're following his cricket career. Still opening batsman, remarkably. Trying to build a margin into his record holding as most games at 300 and...
325, 330, something like that. They're
Not
all
that
starting to blur together now.
He also writes about cricket for The Australian and The Times in London. As you know, he's a prolific non-fiction writer and editor, exploring an eclectic range of topics from abortion law to the asbestos scandal, to the cult of CEOs, to true crime and much more. This encyclopedic tome in front of me, which is available in the library, we do need to support the library, called The Office, A Hard-Working History, won the 2013 Douglas Stewart Prize for Non-Fiction. The Office is also the focus of his latest book, which is called The Momentous, Uneventful Day, a Requiem for the Office. Please join me in welcoming Gideon. So we'll get to the book in a moment, but I just wanted to start with Gideon, the Geelong boy. When we spoke earlier, you were speaking quite affectionately about the Geelong Library. What role did that have in your life as a boy?
Well, libraries have been sort of integral to my whole life. I got into the habit of going into them, though, here in the old municipal library, which I guess some of you might recall. It was a sort of a weekend rite for my mother and I to go into the library and to choose our books. I chose my books carefully because I only had 4 to choose from in the junior section. It was a major step forward when I moved to the senior section and could borrow 6. That was like moving from short pants to long pants. I got to know the cricket section, 796.358, very, very closely, intimately, read all the titles there multiple times. And ever since then, it seems as though I've hardly ever been out of libraries. I was in the State Library just a couple of hours ago. And my mum was a librarian, a school librarian, and we were brought up not in a household that was full of books, but certainly where books were considered an important part of life and they were sort of within arm's reach at all times.
So were you writing as well as reading as a boy?
Yeah, I was writing. I wrote a lot of stories when I was a kid. I think most sort of writers do. Stretch their imagination and exercise their vocabulary and familiarise themselves with popular themes and try to create characters. But I stopped writing fiction the minute that I entered journalism, because I soon realised that the world contained many, many more interesting stories than I could ever dream up.
Who do you write for? Who's your ideal or imagined reader?
Well, I write for I think, an intelligent lay reader. I think every writer writes with an idea of a kind of a horizon of sophistication. I think very highly of my readers, so I don't mind stretching them a bit. And if the reader had to be incarnated as a single person, it would be my mum. If my mum can read it with enjoyment, if my mother can understand it, if my mother can be stimulated by it, if my mother and I can talk about what I've written as a result, then I've done a reasonable job.
And I think your mum's here tonight, isn't she?
I think she is.
Isabel, where are you?
She's over there, she's looking inconspicuous. She's in the mask.
Can I ask you, Isabel, where are you?
I'm here.
Thank you, Brian. We really can't see you from here. Did you know, especially as a librarian and a lover of books, did you have suspicions then that this boy, Gideon, would one day be such a prolific writer?
Well, it's a good job that he was good at writing, because he wasn't much good at maths, were you, Gideon? All right?
No, it's something I share with my daughter, actually.
And there was an organisation in Geelong called TOGA, which stood for Teachers of Geelong Association. And every year that competition was held through the Geelong Advertiser. And he would write away and we would get the entry in, and he won it most times. But I mean, they were quite strange stories, but obviously appealed to teachers. But he was always writing. He was writing little encyclopedias when he was about 5 years old, illustrated.
And you've had to keep up reading all those books ever since?
Yes, occasionally I've been asked to read a book, and my comments on punctuation sometimes don't go down terribly well, but I'm going to keep trying.
Well, before we get on to the latest book, just quickly, what's your favourite of his books?
Oh, without a doubt, I love The Vincibles, The Diary of a Club Cricket Season. That is my favourite. Very light-hearted, very light-hearted.
And written for somebody who's not necessarily a cricket fan.
Yes, that's exactly right, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel. Was that a surprise? Did you know that that was your mum's favourite book?
No, I didn't actually. I'd never asked her before. But my mum's always my first reader. I often, the minute that I finish something, I always send it to my mother. And in fact, she proofread my last book for me. The last two books, I think, she proofread, because I know that it matters to her to do a good job.
Well, I think he's taken note of the punctuation sense. Well, let's move on to the momentous, uneventful day, a requiem for the office. You haven't worked in an office since 1995 when you left the Australian. So what was it that struck you when you walked into that office in the middle of lockdown in Melbourne in May last year that made you think, I'm going to write about
Well, I mean, I, having not worked in an office doesn't mean that I haven't been into offices, and I actually find offices quite fascinating. When I go in to visit someone at their workplace, I'm always interested in the way in which people express their individuality, even in the face of sort of corporate conformity. I find the office a really interesting human space where, despite the tendency to converge on a model of efficiency, people have ways of making it characteristic and reflective of themselves. But as you say, one of the reasons why I got interested in this book was because of lockdown, and all of a sudden people couldn't go to their offices, and we're obviously in the face of a major kind of social experiment. The interesting thing for me was that the technology had been in our hands for a long time, where we could work remotely. Everyone is familiar with the idea of doing some work from home, taking a phone call at home, answering a work email, reading a report in the privacy of their own home. But we'd always felt reasons to continue to flock towards our offices like migratory birds and to come home in the evening. And all of a sudden we didn't have that option. So we were taking what had previously been an option and making it mandatory. And it happened that a friend of mine was going to give me a report that he'd written. The report was on his desk at the office, so we made an agreement to go in and to his office to collect it. And it did really feel like we were sort of exploring. I don't know, has anyone seen Alien, the Nostromo, the huge corridors of the empty spaceship? It felt a little bit like that, entering the airlock and moving around through this spookily deserted space. And at the time, of course, it was lockdown. There wasn't an awful lot happening. The phone wasn't ringing. There wasn't an awful lot of compulsory writing to do. I thought, well, I should write a book about this interesting social phenomenon, because in some ways it's the logical endpoint of the book that I wrote 10 years earlier. What would life be like if there were no offices? What would we be leaving behind, and how would we explain the office and how it would evolve to people who were strangers to it?
When you walked into an office, or whenever you have an idea about a book, what does that feel like? Does it feel like inspiration? Do you know that that's going to be a book?
Well, it's a slow process. It's a slow process of kind of falling in love with your subject, and you first of all you kind of interrogate the subject and see whether there's enough there to intrigue you, to keep you interested, because it's always it's a bit of a speculation. You're taking a leap in the dark. I already knew in this case that I was very interested in offices, and I had an awful lot of kind of mental lumber in my head from the experience of writing that book 10 years earlier, and I felt as though there were things that I perhaps could say more concisely and perhaps more in a more argued sense about offices than I'd done 10 years earlier. That the office, A Hardworking History, as you can tell from its specifications, it's 200,000 words. It's basically all you've ever wanted to know about offices but were afraid to ask. My friend John Clark once said to me that it should come complete with its own office to read it in. But I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I found it utterly fascinating. It's a subject that I had sort of scoped out for the preceding 10 years and waited until the time was right to write it. And it just seemed like the time was ripe to revisit the subject and to turn it over in my mind again. Did you feel like you were writing a Requiem about the obituary for the office as you were writing it? Because in the midst of lockdown in Melbourne, that must have felt a little bit dystopian. It did feel dystopian, and it wasn't just the offices. It was the city itself. It was the act of actually going to the office, walking through streets that are normally thronged with people, that all of a sudden were deserted. But one of the things that struck me was that people assimilated the change quite easily. It wasn't nearly as convulsive a change as perhaps people had anticipated. If someone had told us a year earlier that we'd be doing all our work from home, we would have said, well, I'm not quite sure about that. But we actually, we saw the positives. We took the positives from it. And the positives were significant. For a start, some work was better than no work, or it was certainly better than unsafe work. So there was a solace in that. And it also had that undergirding of reassurance for the work taking place in somewhere that's very familiar to us, that has pleasant associations, the home. We missed some aspects of office life. We missed our companions and seeing them directly, but we certainly didn't miss our commute to work, which is drudgerous and tedious. And while we missed the incidental pleasures of office life, we didn't perhaps miss so much the tiresome formalities and rigmarole that goes into preparing for an office and departing that space at the same time. So I think a lot of employers looked at how effective and efficient people were in spaces other than the office and thought, well, maybe there's room to continue this experiment. And I think a year on from that first lockdown, businesses are still thinking about how they can potentially take advantage of the fact that workers can work so efficiently in environments other than a formal office space.
And do you think that will come down to a question of economics ultimately, now that bosses have got past the relinquishing of control? Because it seemed that when we had the technological capacity that you write about, back in the 80s, this was possible. Some were working from home, many from cafes, at least some of the time.
Yeah.
But nobody really wanted to trust that their workers would actually work if they didn't go to work.
Yeah, there's still some strange manifestations of that. Like, I was down at my cricket club at the weekend, and there's a teammate of mine, Aravinda. He got a job last year in Canberra, public service job. He got it the day before lockdown, the first lockdown. So he immediately had to pack up his flat in the back of his station wagon and drive to the border in order to get to Canberra to accept this job. Anyway, I haven't seen him for 8 months, and so I said, how's the job going? He'd just come back from Melbourne for a visit. He said, you know what, I've been into the office once since I got to Canberra. It was so important for me to get to Canberra, but I didn't in the end. I could have done the job from Melbourne. So there is still a gravitational pull that the office exerts, even when we don't actually go to it. We feel as though we need to be near it.
Just in case.
Just in case.
Do you think that's going to change?
I think, as you say, economic forces will dictate a lot of how total this change is. If global recession is significant, and there is an overriding pressure for cost cutting, obviously high cost infrastructure in major cities is an expense that can conceivably be cut. We've seen it.
Well, COVID bumped climate change out of the headlines and out of public discourse to a large extent. Will that also be a factor? You talked about the commute. Many people commute, 20-minute commute. That's a nice airlock, as you describe it, to debrief from work, get your head ready to face the kids at home or whatever you're facing when you get home. But many people commute much longer than 20 minutes, especially people who live in the country and then go to metropolises. Do you think that the environmental factors will become another consideration?
Yeah, I mean, office buildings, if you really look at them, are highly inefficient usages of space. For most of the 24-hour period, they're empty. A lot of the time, people aren't in their offices anyway, so they're sort of glorified vertical cabinets. People have looked at lots of ways of mitigating the footprint of offices, but they still use up a lot of energy, they still use up a lot of space, and they still, as you say, require getting to and from.
Well, if the factory was the building of the 1800s, the office, the legacy of the 20th century, what do you think will be, if you had to predict, not being a futurologist and really spending much more of your time delving into history than predicting the future, but if you were to take a punt after looking back, what do you think is going to be next?
Well, it might well be the home, mightn't it? And in some ways that would represent a reunion for the office, because office work has existed for a lot longer than there have been designated specialised spaces for us to do office work in. Office work is, clerical and accounting and bookkeeping and organisational. That can take place anywhere you can put a book down. In the 1700s, it took place on the corner of the kitchen table in a farm, where the farmer, did his accounts at the end of a harvest. It was only when communications technology and transportation allowed a separation between the home and the office that the office began to assume a separate identity. And as you say, I think that the office was the decisive or the formative building of the 20th century. In some respects, it's as massive a change as was the Industrial Revolution, sort of an information revolution, whereby a whole lot of people, most people, the majority of workers are working in tertiary industry, where what they do is they work with symbols, they work with outcomes that are not material, that do not produce a material artefact at the end of them, and are basically about dealing with people like themselves.
So will we end up then, though, with a two-tier society with those who can work from home do, but then we end up with a whole other sector of blue-collar work where people have to go to work, or will that end up just being robotic?
That's a good point. I mean, I think that, I think society is already two tiers in lots of ways already, or multiple tiers. I think that certainly the caring industries are going to be substantial presences in a future economy, because you can't care for people remotely. You can't Zoom meet the woman who you're meant to be delivering a meal to in a retirement home. So those are going to be a significant economic force in the 21st century. But I think we're going to be working more towards hybrid spaces, or a hybrid means of working, where only those forms of informational work that actually require face-to-face collaboration will be done in specialised spaces. And in some ways, what happened last year was a reversal, a welcome reversal of a steady process of the erosion of privacy at work, with the advent from the 1960s of cubicle living, open plan offices. Gradually, people have been forced closer and closer together. People have been reined in, forced to. It's been sort of sold to them as encouraging collaboration and interaction, but it's really actually just reducing the footplate of offices and reducing costs. But I think one of the things that people enjoyed about working from home last year was the opportunity to work without disturbance, without someone looking over their shoulder, without someone walking past them and tapping them on the shoulder and telling them a joke, or involving them in a function, a birthday for someone that they don't even like. Those kind of disturbances that are naturally sewn into an office day all of a sudden slipped to one side, and we found that we actually needed privacy in order to get the job done.
Well, speaking of privacy, the cubicle in the office never really gave us that. And among many people who I'd never heard of and found strangely fascinating was a fellow who you describe as the Oppenheimer of the office, the father of the cubicle, Robert Propst. Tell us about him. Because you've got all these people who seem to have had an inordinate influence on how entire Western civilization has been shaped in many ways. Yeah,
I mean, Robert Propst was a highly eclectic and innovative thinker. He was actually an inventor fundamentally. I think he issued 120 patents in the course of his career, all sorts of things to do with agriculture and science and technology and medicine. But the main innovation that he's most associated with is the cubicle, and it came about because he was recruited by a company called Herman Miller, big American furniture company, in the late 1950s. Herman Miller was interested in diversifying away from furniture at that time, but Propst, in the course of fitting out his office at Ann Arbor, found the furniture really irritating, really uncomfortable. It didn't sort of work to his advantage, didn't sort of help his thought processes, and he thought, well, what I should really do is I should try to redesign the office. I should create sort of multiple workspaces that suit all sorts of different kinds of work, that allow free circulation within an office space, that actually allow people to talk to one another, that do away with the traditional status markers of offices, like the big desk with the big door and the secretary. It was actually quite an adventurous and innovative idea. The invention was eventually called by Herman Miller the action office, which is, I think, a lovely kind of sort of almost contradictory idea, the idea of action taking place in an office, but that was the challenging notion that he was floating. And one of the key features of the action office was the idea of space being demarcated by freestanding partitions which went to being formed into cubicles. And they were meant to be flexible. They were meant to work at different angles, and you were meant to be able to shape them into spaces that suited you. But the great irony of the cubicle was that it almost automatically got fixed together at right angles and became boxes for people to work in. It went from being this wonderful idea about the free circulation of ideas to just another way of penning workers up and confining them and reducing them, in fact, in the status of their fellow workers. Probst was asked at the end of his career why, whether he was disappointed by what had happened about the cubicle, and he said, "Well, I never had any illusions about the world being perfect, but this was a really, really stupid idea, putting people up in cubicles. Nonetheless, it was an idea that, for all sorts of cost-based reasons, like the ones that I outlined before, immediately seized people's imagination, particularly the imagination of corporate treasurers, because there was a Revenue Act in America at the time that allowed partitions to be written down on tax at the same speed as typewriters and office desks, rather than 7 years, rather than 35 years in the case of actually fixed walls. So it was actually economically much more sensible to install partitions that you could ostensibly move rather than erect walls that you obviously couldn't.
You've drawn on a smorgasbord of sources for this, from Dickens through to obscure academic titles like the Journal of Human Factors. It is surprisingly quite a lot of fun, though. What surprised you the most about what you found out about the history of the development of the office?
I guess one of the things that always delighted me about writing about offices was to discover that office behaviours actually haven't changed that much across the generations. The earliest kind of really interesting sort of first-hand account of office life is Samuel Pepys's diaries. Samuel Pepys was an official in the naval office in the 1600s, and when he writes about the office and his co-workers, he has exactly the same complaints about them as we make about people now. This guy's incredibly boring. He never shuts up. This guy's a terrible attention seeker. He takes up a lot of oxygen. If I do my work really well, I can get the attention of the boss, and I might get on. I might get the promotion that I deserve. I'm really bored today in the office. I got nothing to do. I'm looking out the window. And he also had a number of sexual assignations in the office. So he actually understood the kind of the eroticism of the office at the same time. And it was delightful to read works like Samuel Pepys's diary, or to read, say, Balzac's novels, The Government Clerks, which is written in the early 1800s, which is an absolutely perfect depiction of the way in which a bureaucracy office operates, instantly recognisable to anyone who's watched The Office by Ricky Gervais. When people write about The Office, they really go to town. There is some absolutely fantastic writing about The Office that you recognise types, you understand behaviours, you get behind the characters the character types that people assume in office spaces, and it's kind of delightful because it's a world that we all inhabit. Writing about The Office is writing about the history that we're all in, that we've all played a part in, that's actually happening around us, that we tend to neglect because it's so familiar to us.
Well, and it also dominates popular culture. I mean, your book is peppered with an amazing score, as you describe it, of TV series and movies. The Jetsons, The Office we've already mentioned. Jetsons, sorry, The Office, The Apartment. Is that just to make it interesting?
No, it wasn't to make it interesting. It's because there was an American sociologist called C. Wright Mills who said that the history of The Office is a history without events. And in some respects he's right, because the great tea trolley disaster of 1958 does not have a book devoted to it. But
although you will find it mentioned in the encyclopedic version. But
it has a strong kind of cultural imprint. It has a strong impress on our ideas. And often those ideas are best realised in the form of fiction and movie and TV and theatre.
So what will we write about in popular culture if the office doesn't continue to exist?
I think we're still writing about it. I think it's got legs, the office.
It's going to be around for a while, yeah?
And even if we're not experiencing it directly, we'll still be feeling nostalgic about it. Like I said, I haven't worked in an office since 1995, but I still feel nostalgic about the days that I had in the office, the people that I worked alongside, the communal experiences that I had. Because what you don't get, obviously, in a world of Zoom and Google Meets, is you don't get the communal experience. Your interaction is highly formalised, highly sterilised, limited to kind of one-to-one, on a technology that still is, I think, relatively clumsy, that puts us in an uncomfortable position where we don't have an ability to respond to one another's physical cues, where we actually feel slightly closer to the other person than we would be in everyday life. We don't quite know where to look. Our eyes move in a quite a volatile fashion. And when it's over, it's over. The screen falls blank and we go back to what we're doing. We don't have that informality that the best offices that have and the best interactions often hinge on.
But you will find some great reporting of Zoom phone calls and people's bookshelves in the background, and one of the best examples is Gideon. So look up that Sydney Morning Herald article to see an example, a beautiful photo of your very impressive library. So in terms of those technological developments, and you explore quite a number through the book, which one do you think had the most impact? And there were a series of those. I guess which one struck you the most?
Well, I think the most momentous is one that we don't think of as a technological development, which is the coming of women to the office. Now, before the office, work
You say that's technology?
Well, they were labour-saving devices. They were cheap labour-saving devices in the early days of the office. And they gained a foothold in the office precisely because women were so good at doing boring jobs and doing them for very little money. Before the office, work had been extensively gender-typed. There were certain female occupations and certain male occupations. On the farm, the man toiled in the fields and the woman tended the hearth. Women taught and they were governesses and they were domestics. It was men who occupied the commanding heights of the professions and the kind of and labour, physical labour. The office is the first place where women and men work alongside one another in proximity and in numbers and in a dynamic fashion where they're actually interacting. In the early days of women coming to the office, there was such foreboding about the potentially disruptive impact of women in the office that there were steps taken to kind of sequester women from the rest of the office space. I think I quote something like the US Bureau of Agriculture. The first female employee had to work in the basement and was not allowed to be visited by any male member of staff over the age of 15. There were things like separate male and female entrances. There were separate male and female lunchrooms, because the idea was that women, by their frivolity or their prettiness, would distract men from the serious business of work, and that men might coarsen femininity by their profanity and their roughness. But pretty soon, economic factors dictated that the most efficient way for an office to operate was for men and women to work alongside one another. And that had, of course, had prodigious entailments, because once men and women are alongside one another, who knows what might happen next?
Well, I think Helen Gurley Brown knew exactly what happened.
Well, exactly, yeah. Helen Gurley Brown's a very fascinating woman. Does everyone remember Helen Gurley Brown, Sex and the Single Girl and Sex in the Office? She was an American advertising woman from the 1950s who worked in a number of offices over the course of that. And she said in hindsight that she never worked in an office where she didn't have a sexual relationship with a man who was working there. And when she got married, when she was safely neutralised, of course, she wrote a book called Sex and the Single Girl, which talked about the rules of engagement for women in offices. A lot of it is now, kind of rather dated and even, slightly sexist. But she was a woman who was quite frank and open about the fact that the office is an emotional workspace. that has kind of that emotional entanglements do happen, and men and women have feelings in relation to one another, because previously there had been a kind of a rationalist model of office behaviour that said that it was a place fundamentally of work, where men and women went fundamentally in order to produce economic outcomes.
I think our office culture is still largely defined, designed, dominated by men.
Yeah.
And I certainly know many women, particularly mothers, but probably not only, who couldn't wait to get back to the office after homeschooling, trying to do their paid work as well. Is the future of the office still going to be dictated by men in spite of that inordinate and disproportionate burden of domestic?
Well, I think that's been one of our major takeaways of last year, is that when men and women are in the home, both trying to do paid work, the burden of domestic labour distributes itself unevenly, that it is still the woman who takes up the slack. Dad is always kind of busy with his stuff. You don't disturb Dad, but Mum is much easier to tap on the shoulder and for the kid to ask, Mum, how do I do these things? And it was something that you sort of predicted, and it actually has now been empirically demonstrated by academics who studied the impact of work under lockdown last year. And I suspect it will take more than solemn resolutions by men to do better to change that. The cultural forces are still too embedded and oppressive.
What about if part-time work became more pervasive for both partners? Would that be the thing that would make the difference both to the physical office and then that sharing of labour?
Well, what worries me is that we're not moving into a world of part-time work. Increasingly, we're moving into a world of work taking place all the time, of actually living at work rather than working from home. Because we're all familiar, at least when there is a physical office space to go to and to come back from, it is possible to close a door behind that office and to leave it behind. Even if the work might follow us on our devices, psychologically it is easier to detach from work if it is penned up principally in a designated space. What I fear for the future, and one of the things that I think people should be aware of as they cheer on the office's demise, is that it did actually serve a purpose. It did actually, even if it overshadowed the domestic sphere, it did preserve the sanctity of that domestic sphere. If work is taking place wherever we are, then potentially there is no escape from it. And I think that should worry every worker. The other thing is that, workers taking place operating in this environment of sort of constant fragmentation and constant interaction find it much more difficult to organise, to agitate, to stand up for their own rights. They're much more easily picked off single-handedly by employers who do not necessarily have their best interests at heart.
Well, you're right also about the trends in management when people were seen as being indispensable and instantly replaceable. And certainly I've worked in commercial television and watched people being told they need to pack their desk and they'll be escorted out by security, and that's as much notice as they've given. That was kind of reassuring to read. It didn't just happen in commercial TV. The insecurity of work has taken on a new dimension now, though, and technology has facilitated that in many ways as well. How is that going to play in, do you think?
Well, of course, if you're not part of the conversation, then you always fear that you are the subject of the conversation. If you're not in the office, there is always that unfortunate feeling that maybe they're talking about you in there, and maybe you're not there to stand up for your rights. Maybe you're not there to get noticed, because one of the reasons why we did go to the office was because we got noticed. It's pretty difficult to get noticed by Zoom. It's pretty difficult to get on under those circumstances. You're readily forgotten. Sorry, I've lost.
Well, I guess that just plays into that effectively answers the question in terms of the impact of that. But you touched on there too the performative aspect of work. Yeah. If we're not dressing up and performing and going somewhere and having that appointment at work, as onerous as it sometimes may be, do we lose from that as well? Do we need to have that other self?
When one of the more delightful pieces of writing I read last year about this change was by Lucy Kellaway. Lucy Kellaway was the management writer for the Financial Times for 25 years. Very funny, very engaging, very scathing writer about office mores and management pretensions. She left the FT 3 years ago to become a teacher, actually, and she started working, doing a lot more work from home. She came back in the FT last year and wrote a piece about the office and what suddenly feeling as though, what were office workers losing in the process of this transition from working from home. And she said that one of the major changes that she had noticed when she ceased to go into the office was that when she had been in the office, the process of getting dressed up and going into the office and being a certain person in that office space had a sort of a dramaturgical or a theatrical aspect to it. You got to play the part, a better version of yourself for a professional consumption. When she went back to working from home, she felt all of a sudden she was the same person everywhere, and it was boring. And I thought there is a genuine truth to that, that we might feel lousy in the office, but we often look pretty good. We've made an effort about ourselves. We've got dressed nicely. We're freshly laundered. We're freshly washed. We're directed. We're purposeful. We're interacting with. We often look as though we know what we're talking about. That makes us attractive, actually, and I think that's the basis of quite a lot of office relationships, is that we look good. We're our best selves. If we don't have that performative aspect to work, I think we can very easily succumb to our worst devices.
Well, in 2003, you wrote about the cult of the CEO. What's going to happen to the CEO, and what influence, I guess, does that have now, looking back, 18 years later, as the workplace is increasingly fragmented as well as work, and we're in this flux of whether we're going to go back to the office, whether offices are going to shrink, and we're still in the middle of that question. How important is the CEO in that, and have we discovered that maybe we don't need them after all, as you asked back then in 2003?
I think the personification of the CEO has changed quite a lot since I wrote Bad Company. I think I was writing in a period of kind of the imperial CEO, which was very much about the trappings of office and the lushness of the perquisites. I think since then, one of the things that changed has been this sort of aggressive egalitarianism, performative egalitarianism in executive culture, which is embodied in Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark Zuckerberg goes everywhere wearing a T-shirt and jeans. He's as rich as Croesus. He's abominably rich. He's richer than virtually all his tribe, but he goes around trying to look like an everyday Joe. And I think the richer and more absurdly elevated CEOs have become, the more aggressively they have prosecuted an image of everydayness. So I think that is something that's changed decisively. I think that the idea of the CEO is perhaps even more significant mythologically as our direct relationship to them ebbs. We seldom see our CEO these days. They occupy a realm that's absurdly rarefied. But when someone is cut off, it's very easy for myths to develop about them, like those areas of the unexplored world in old maps where it said, here be monsters. It's actually quite easy to develop ideas about CEOs that are actually well and truly beyond their capabilities and their actual personalities.
So watch this space.
Always fascinating, always changing. A wonderful, rich subject for any writer. And I've actually been surprised at how few people really do write about it in a kind of in an intellectual sense, because it is such a profound cultural and social and economic change. But perhaps it's so significant, perhaps it's so all-encompassing that we're inclined to ignore it.
What do you hope will come from this? Is it to be a provocation? Were you wanting to capture the history before it's passed? Or are you finding that you're getting caught up a lot in trying to predict, making the prognosis on the future, which we've certainly talked a lot about tonight too?
I've never been a particularly great predictor of things. I don't regard myself as a futurologist or anything like that. I'm not making prophecies about that. What I'm actually trying to demonstrate is how we got to the office that we have now and why it has lasted. Because as I say in the book, the actual tools of trade that can potentially make working from home possible have existed for a long time, really since the mid-1980s, when mobile phones first appeared. But why have we clung to the idea of the office so tenaciously? What purpose has it served that we have gone on needing, that we have continued to patronise? And what would we lose if it were to disappear? And that's what I'm trying to kind of dramatise and bring to people's attention. The story actually at stages last year seemed to be moving so fast that it was very, very difficult to keep up with. But I think perhaps as we kind of drift back to something like normality, we're at the risk of forgetting what last year's experiment was all about and what we actually demonstrated and what actually might be the consequences of it.
Well, keep reading the book to have that top of mind, I think, because it really is an interesting exploration. But now it is your turn to ask anything that I didn't come up with. Anybody got a question for Gideon? If you'd like to put your hand up and we will bring you a microphone. Gentleman at the front can kick us off.
I think I need a microphone.
We're going to give you one anyway. Okay. For the recording.
Okay, thanks very much. Gideon, lovely to see you here.
Great to be here, actually.
Fabulous.
Can I just say how great it is to be here with a live audience that's not on Zoom? Boy, I'm not used to this.
Who do you read? Whether it's for... Who do you read? Yes, for pleasure.
That's a good question. Because it's an important question, I think, for any writer. The first question I ask a lot of young writers is, who are you reading? Because I think a well-stocked bookshelf or a discriminating choice or an idea that you should read the best of what's available is a distinguishing characteristic of good writers. I think I would have to say I read eclectically. I write eclectically, so I read eclectically. I go through phases where I read only fiction, where I read only non-fiction. I often read for purpose, if you like. If I'm reading around a subject, I want to read things that are kind of associated with that subject, things that might give me ideas. Other writers' response to the same ideas, to the same predicaments and challenges. I read a book earlier today. I might as well tell you, I read a book called The Remittance Man by Ambrose Pratt. No one will know of Ambrose Pratt here, but he was a hugely popular novelist in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And I was reading the other day about remittance men. Is anyone familiar with the term? The remittance men were men who were sent, who for various reasons, their families in Britain wanted to get rid of them, and they'd send them to the colonies and keep them out of the way, and periodically send them remittances in order to keep them out of trouble. Often they would be sort of illegitimate sons or scapegraces or spendthrifts. So I was reading about the remittance men, and I saw there was a novel by Ambrose Pratt called The Remittance Men. I'll go and read that in the Heritage Collection of the State Library, just to see what I'd read previous novels by Ambrose Pratt. And often, like I said, in terms of doing the Office book, sometimes people put things in fiction, ideas in fiction, explore ideas in fiction that tell you something about the society that was reading about them and in which that book was being written. So I did get an interesting understanding of the social status of the remittance man and popular responses to the character, assumptions that they nursed about them, and resentments that they also nourished. So often I'm kind of responding to the ideas of the day. Oh, I'm interested in that. I might go and read something like that, or I'll read. I'm always interested in gap filling where my reading is concerned. Because I've got a classic kind of journalist's knowledge of things. I have concentrations of knowledge in various places that are kind of interspersed with huge vistas of ignorance. And I feel like going to fill in those gaps from time to time. Oh, I've never read this guy. I should go and read 2 or 3 books by him. Or I never read this this woman's non-fiction. I should go and people say good things about her. So I read for purpose. I don't read lazily. I don't read recreationally. I read like a writer, I hope, in order to make myself into a better writer.
Good question.
Good question.
Sorry, just wait for just half a second. We'll get a mic to you, and then we'll come to you next. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon and Bernadette. It's been a fantastic talk. I consider myself a work-from-home rebel. I work for the ATO, and I work at Dandenong office in a brand new building. It's probably 5 years old, and I would dare say that I have been... Well, COVID's been March until still ongoing, and we have an occupancy rate, I would say, on my floor. If there's 200 people, there'd be probably 6 people working on the floor. Wow. I was forced to work from home in August. Since COVID, I've had 1 month's annual leave. I've had one batch of 1 month, another batch of 5 weeks, and I worked quite well from home for probably, I don't know, 4 months, but my efficiency was really well down.
Really interesting, right?
Oh, like for a 40-hour week,
Yeah.
I might do 6 one day, but then I'd have to catch up on the weekend.
Right.
So I consider myself a work-from-home rebel,
Right.
and I would dare say, out of 500 staff, I would have done the most days in the office,
Right.
and jumped at the opportunity to come back. Your thoughts? This is a COVID thing,
Yeah.
not really an office thing.
Yes. Well, like I said, there are certain things that you can do in an office that you just can't do anywhere else. There's no denying that. There's no escaping it, and we shouldn't be afraid of acknowledging it. I think we did a lot of work last year that was kind of low-hanging fruit, work that was easy to do in particular circumstances. I think as work gets more demanding and more complex, we're going to find more and more limitations in working from home. It was basically about keeping the lights on last year, wasn't it? It was about keeping things going because the alternative was stopping, and who knew whether we'd start again. So I think we did a lot of kind of busy work last year. I think we did a lot of staving off. But as we rehearse working from home, we're going to find more and more limitations, as well as the kind of the social efficacy of going to the office that I mentioned before. The idea of being able to go to an office and to leave it behind. It's very interesting about the ATO. Must be spooky being in there. You could play a great game of office cricket though, couldn't you?
But it's a great discipline because you arrive there, you're there for 8 hours, there's no distraction.
Yeah.
I get my work done.
Yes. So you think you're working better in the office with 6 people than you did with 200 people?
Yes, I do.
You do, right.
But I still work very well even with 200 people. But yeah, the work from home, it was all right for a while.
Yeah. Yep.
The novelty might wear off, you think?
Well, look, I've worked from home since 1995. So you would have thought that I would have adapted very readily to working from home because there was no change. But I hated it. I hated it because when it goes from being voluntary to mandatory, when there is no variety, when it's completely unavoidable, when that is the only way to do work, it just became oppressive. So I'm very glad to see the end of lockdown. It made a big difference to me.
Gentleman in the back row.
Hi, Gideon. Thank you. This was quite interesting. I have to say, I heard you use the words corporate conformity And I really like that. Isn't that quite something? I mean, are you speaking to an actual phenomenon that takes place in the world, corporate conformity?
I think so.
I mean, we conform on the streets, do we not? Anyway, I digress. I had to write out my question because it was a bit difficult to articulate. My friend works an office job, and we had a conversation about one of the biggest challenges facing working from home. He said a serious challenge was injuries taking place at home. Who is liable in this instance? The place of work or no? And he said that there was no clear answer.
No, there is no clear answer. No.
Yeah. So what do you think about? Yeah. What do you?
There's a whole lot of things that are unclear about the status of working from home. Who does the space belong to? Because you've basically given your own space to office at no cost to the office. You're saving them colossal sums of money and providing, volunteering your own space, your own setting, your own electricity, your own bandwidth.
Your expensive printer ink.
Yeah, exactly. I think people left those things to one side last year in the kind of the panic of the moment, but those are things that are obviously going to have to be clarified if it's going to become a bigger part of our working life. You're waving, Stephen. Oh, sorry.
I'd like to fit in one more question.
But it's a very good question, and it's once again it's a watch this space. Clerical unions should have a very strong eye on it.
I really appreciate your comments about the role of women in the office and, how they've evolved over time. Certainly, during lockdown, it was incredibly... There were some advantages for women in that they didn't have to drive anywhere, so they could get the kids to school, they could put the washing on, they could do the lunches somewhere in between.
What a huge advantage.
I know.
They didn't have to do sport drop-off as well.
Do that as well. From the other point of view, working from home and having schooling from home meant that you were never away from anything. And if you were part-time, even on the day that you were off, you were on. So I think that women deserve a big round of applause.
Absolutely.
And it'll be interesting to see. I think a lot of women did miss that social interaction that they do get from the workplace. So, I mean, where it evolves in the future. But I think, some years ago, there was a lot of discussion about employers said women have to be there 9 to 5, and there were a group of women who said, no, we want to be able to work flexibly.
Yes.
So I think flexible workplaces for both men and women could be very advantageous in the future, wherever it goes for your next book. Thanks.
I think sometimes those notions of flexibility have been sold to people on a false premise. Company-funded childcare, for instance. It's not something provided out of the goodness of the employer's heart. That's in order to extract more work from you. So a lot of things that have been presented as enlightened are actually just other ways of extracting economic value. And work-life balance, well, that again is another thing that, the work comes first, doesn't it? You never talk about life-work balance, do you? It's been the way since they invented the term.
So there'll be no balance if there's no office work.
No, that's right, yeah. At least there was some sort of concept, at least there was some sort of equilibrium that people were able to establish. What I fear is, as I said before, that working from home will become living at work.
It's not a grim book, though. It is very entertaining, as has been Gideon, and I would like you to join me in thanking him for his always erudite and enlightening and provoking conversation.
Thanks,
provocative. So, as book lovers, as I know you all are, you know that we need to support both our libraries and our booksellers. So you can buy a copy of Gideon's book in the back corner from our independent Geelong bookstore, Cook & Young at Westfield, formerly Dimmicks. And so they have copies of the Momentous Uneventful Day, a Requiem for the office for you if you would like to buy a copy. And as a special bonus, just tonight, you can have it signed by Gideon. Thank
really
you.
signed, not by Zoom.
That's right. In real person. This might never happen again. Thank you all for coming on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you again. And do flick through this one. Go and borrow this one out too.